Hello students and welcome to the Excel at English channel where I produce videos to help A-level students revise texts on the A-level Combined Language and Literature course for AQA exam board. This particular video features an analysis of the poem Stafford Afternoons from the collection Meantime by Carol Ann Duffy. If you've watched other videos in this series, you will know that I suggest you read the poem several times before you attempt an analysis. If you are revising the poem, you should refresh your familiarity with it by reading the poem a couple of times, ignoring your annotations, and just trying to get a feel for the language, the key events, and in subsequent readings exploring the idea of voice and trying to really hear the poem in your mind's ear. Stafford Afternoons. Only there the afternoons could suddenly pause, and when I looked up from lacing my shoe, a long road held no one, the gardens were empty, an ice cream van chimed and dwindled away. On the motorway bridge, I waved at windscreens, oddly hurt by the blurred waves back, the speed. So I let a horse in the noisy field sponge at my palm and invented, in colour, a vivid lie for us both. In a cul-de-sac, a strange boy threw a stone. I crawled through a hedge into long grass, at the edge of a small wood, lonely and thrilled. The green silence gulped once and swallowed me whole. I knew it was dangerous. The way the trees drew sly faces from light and shade, the wood let out its sticky breath on the back of my neck, and flowering nettles gathered spit in their throats. Too late. Touch, said the long-haired man, who stood legs apart by a silver birch with a living purple root in his hand. The sight made sound rush back, birds, a distant lawnmower, his hoarse frightful endearments as I backed away, then ran all the way home, into a game where children scattered and shrieked and time fell from the sky like a red ball. So in summary, the poem narrates the story of a dreamlike day, or that should probably be a dreamlike afternoon in Stafford. The narrator describes absent-mindedly venturing into the woods, perhaps motivated by boredom, beyond the motorway. And when in the woods, a man exposes himself to her, a really kind of unpleasant and quite shocking event. The themes of this poem are childhood and innocence, a moment of kind of awakening or a moment of loss of innocence. The ideas of boredom and time and the passage of time. There's sort of distorted time frames within this poem. Memory is a clear theme, as is fear, perhaps related to that kind of loss of innocence and this fear of growing up and losing your childhood innocence. There are clear representations of place in this poem. Suburbia is given a very clear representation through the description of Stafford, and the woods, kind of threatening natural environment, is represented here. In terms of voice, the poem is a narrative poem that has the feel of a personal childhood narrative, recounting a kind of a shocking event from someone's childhood. And we can very well assume that at least part of the poem is autobiographical. Whether or not this actual event ever happened to Duffy, I don't know, but I don't think it particularly matters. The fact is that it conveys a kind of threatening experience, and we also know that Duffy herself was raised in Stafford. A few things that you may just need to know, very basic key information, that for your information, Stafford is a town between Birmingham and Manchester, which sits on the M6 motorway. So its location is represented very clearly in the poem, but also its proximity to the motorway, which forms in the poem a kind of barrier between the safety of suburbia and this threatening space beyond in the woods. A few key distinctive features that we find in the language of this poem. both looking at lexis and semantics. There is a range of visual imagery in the poem. The poem is very rich visually, so there's a kind of lexical field of visual description. Perhaps connected to that line, I invented in colour a vivid lie. This idea that the childhood imagination is so vivid that things appear to be perhaps brighter or more exaggerated than they may be in real life. This includes a lot of colour adjectives, green, silver, purple and red, as well as these changing light and shade of the wood. The poem is also rich in sound, and so we have another very strong kind of sensory theme or a sensory stylistic pattern here. And this is through auditory images which help to create another kind of distorted or exaggerated reality. So we have the chiming and dwindling of the ice cream van, which is a really effective way of establishing a sense of kind of isolation and loneliness, and possibly acts as a kind of symbol for the end of childhood. Later we have the noisy field by the motorway, which the speed and the noise of the motorway helps to create a contrast with the wood, with that green silence that gulped once and swallows me whole. And so we get a kind of a changing of space from the isolated and silent wood, from the busy and distorting motorway to this isolating silent wood. And that contrast really helps establish some tension in the poem leading up to the dramatic event of the assault. The threatening silence of the wood is the backdrop then for that single spoken word touch, which is italicized in the poem, which has very much breaks the kind of tension that has been built through the description of the wood. Following that, we get this sort of rush of sound in which Duffy describes a series of sounds suddenly coming back to break the silence. Again, conveying a sense of distorted reality, or the way that a shocking event has the power to distort the senses, at least in the way that we recall it through memory. So finally, the children, one of the sounds within that rush of sounds that returns is that of the children shrieking. Of course, children, when they are playing, naturally scream and shriek, but we know that verb shrieked has a kind of a double meaning, implying perhaps this internalized panic and horror that the child may well have felt having seen the man expose himself. So let's look at a couple of stanzas for close analysis. You might look there and at the text highlighted in red, and to think as the poem develops how the narrative is structured in terms of discourse structure. There are short sentences, a technique used in several of Duffy's poems, that she likes to open a stanza with a short sentence which has the effect of kind of establishing topic in a stanza, or often developing, progressing a narrative. In these two examples here, I feel like the short sentences are very much building tension and developing tension within a narrative. So we have I knew it was dangerous, which obviously creates an element of threat, and then we get that climactic moment, which you might say is kind of the climax of the building tension within this narrative, delivered through that discourse feature, too late. The longer forms that Duffy uses after this, that in jam between stanzas 5 and 6, I think represent this kind of panicked race to get home. So in the final stanza, we don't get that feature of the short opening line or the short opening sentence form in the stanza. Instead, we get a much longer, extended, rushed sentence that leads all the way to the end of the poem. Looking at some of these distorted senses and some of the lexis and semantics that conveys distorted senses, as highlighted in green, the description of the wood is deeply threatening, and and this is a key device that helps to build up tension in the narrative. But it's achieved cleverly through a series of personifications here, a pattern of personifications, all of which attribute menacing human features to the wood, those sly faces, the sticky breath, and the gathering spit in the throats of the nettles. So we've got a series here of human body parts being ascribed to aspects of the wood, and this is important because there's a pattern here, a lexical field of body parts, which is leading to quite an unpleasant direction. The closeness of that sensory feeling the breath on the back of my neck is very, very effective at establishing the vulnerability of the child in this situation and that kind of unwelcome intimacy. And it's very much foreshadowing the assault which follows in the next stanza. That pattern of physical language, that lexical field of body parts continues through the description of the man. The man in some ways is kind of he kind of blends in to the threatening appearance of the wood, in that the patterns of language used to describe the wood are continued in describing the man. But the key thing is that the personification is reversed. Duffy, I think, somewhat euphemistically describes the man's significant body part as a purple root. Here we see an objectifying metaphor that takes a human, kind of the reverse of a personification, almost in that a human thing is being given an object quality. And that runs in with that pattern of language that presents the threat of nature. This is a partly euphemistic purpose because Duffy avoids naming this part of the man's body directly. And I feel like in writing the poem, she could have chosen to use a dysphomistic term for the man's body part for a kind of immediate shock factor. But presenting the metaphor in this way kind of sets up what I would call a poetic double take. I think in reading this poem, the first time you read it, you often want to go back and reread this line so that you can actually clearly understand what Duffy is describing here, or what that purple root particularly means. So when you double check the meaning of those lines, there are other contextual clues in the dialogue, such as the man's, his imperative dialogue touch, the adverbial legs apart, and that adjective living, which very much makes obvious that the purple root is metaphorical and not actually a natural feature of the woods. So those things help you to clearly identify what's being described here, but you have to do a kind of poetic double take. So the initial ambiguity of those lines, I think, help capture the kind of shock or almost disbelief that you would feel if you were to be assaulted in this way. If you were to see someone expose themselves unexpectedly to you, you might do a kind of double take similar to the poetic double take that Duffy establishes here. In terms of comparing this poem to others, you could compare perhaps the way that shocking events are delivered in this poem and in Litany, both of which are poems about growing up and about loss of innocence, and both of which are reasonably situated, or you could reasonably suggest are anecdotes from Duffy's own childhood. So a couple of kind of contextual links between those poems, but they both present shocking events in a poetic way. You could compare the way that growing up is presented in Captain and in this poem. Of course, Captain has his confidence and goes about stamping out the traces of badgers and skunks in his country. This is somewhat contrasted to the vulnerability of childhood as presented in this poem, and would certainly make an interesting essay to compare them to. As always, the poem of place in Meantime is Never Go Back, and a number of sinister personifications in Never Go Back could be connected very meaningfully to the sinister personifications of the wood in this poem. And then finally, distortion of time, which we know is a theme very much of this entire collection, but which is present very much in the final poem, Meantime. You, of course, could pick a poem from random at the list and think about the ways in which you could not only thematically connect that poem to Stafford afternoons, but also think of any connections that might be possible in terms of connecting similar or different uses of language. Finally, here is a very powerful poem which I like very much from an inspiring young poet called Yrsa Daley-Ward. This is from her collection, Bone. From one who says, don't cry, you'll like it after a while, and two who tells you thank you after the fact and can't look at your face, to three who pays for your breakfast and a cab home and your mother's rent, to four who says, but you felt so good I didn't know how to stop, to five who says, giving your body is tough but something you do very well, to six who smells of tobacco and says, come on, I can feel that you love this. To those who feel bad in the morning, yes, some feel bad in the morning. And sometimes they tell you you want it, and sometimes you think that you do. Thank heavens you're resetting, ever setting and resetting. How else do you sew up the tears? How else can the body survive? Okay guys, thank you for your focus and attention. Don't forget to check out some of the other videos in this series if you are revising the anthology. Also check out other playlists on other A-level Lang and Lit topics. Please subscribe and throw me a positive comment if you feel that the work I'm doing here is worthwhile for you. Thank you.